For centuries, one name has echoed through the mist of Britain's ancient past, a name that conjures visions of prophecy, sorcery, and wisdom. Merlin. To speak his name is to summon the atmosphere of enchanted forests, the whisper of destiny in the halls of Camelot, and the image of a hooded figure guiding kings and kingdoms through the uncertain tides of history. Merlin is not just a character from stories. He is a symbol, an archetype, and for many a mystery still unresolved. Was he a man of history, a prophet sent to guide rulers in a time of chaos? Was he a sorcerer whose power came from forbidden arts, or was he a messenger carrying wisdom that transcended both the pagan and the Christian? Bridging two worlds in transition. This introduction sets the stage for a journey into one of the most enigmatic figures in all mythology, a journey that promises to uncover not only the legend of Merlin, but also the deeper truths that lie beneath his story. When we think of Merlin, many of us picture the white-bearded wizard of fairy tales and modern films, the magical companion to King Arthur who could summon storms and bend fate with a wave of his staff. Yet the true Merlin is far older, more complex, and far more unsettling. His origins are rooted in the collapse of the Roman Empire, a time when Britain was torn between memory and reinvention, between the old gods of the Druids and the rising tide of Christianity. It was in this crucible of change that the Merlin legend was born, and it was here that his story became a mirror for humanity's greatest struggles: chaos and order, faith and doubt, power and sacrifice. Merlin's story endures, not because he was a magician in the sense of stage tricks or fantasy illusions, but because he embodied the timeless figure of the prophet. Like Elijah in the wilderness, like Daniel interpreting dreams before kings, Merlin stood at the edge of the known world, whispering truths that rulers could not ignore. He was the voice that said destiny is real, and every empire must decide whether to heed its warning or fall into ruin. For Arthur, Merlin became more than an advisor. He became the invisible architect of a kingdom that aspired to justice, honor, and equality. Camelot was not built of stone alone. It was built on the vision Merlin planted, the dream that mankind could reflect heaven's order on earth. But Merlin's greatness also carried a shadow. His legends often tell us of his strange birth, a child with no human father, conceived by mysterious forces that blurred the line between divine and demonic. In this paradox, we see the essence of his character, a man of dual natures, carrying both the light of prophecy and the dark suspicion of sorcery. Medieval chroniclers struggled with him, asking whether Merlin was a saintly guide sent by God, or a dangerous magician ensnared by fallen powers. This tension is why his story resonates so powerfully, even now. Because in Merlin, we glimpse our own battle between wisdom and temptation, between seeking the divine and falling to our own pride. What makes Merlin so captivating is not merely his role in Arthurian romance, but his symbolic weight. He represents the archetype of the wise guide, the one who knows the path even when the hero is blind. Without Merlin, Arthur may never have risen from a boy of obscure birth to the king who drew the sword from the stone. Without Merlin, the vision of Camelot may never have been planted in the soil of Britain's imagination. And yet, even as he guided others, Merlin's own life was marked by tragedy, betrayal, imprisonment, and silence. He was a man who could foresee the future, but not escape it. He was a prophet who shaped kingdoms, yet was undone by his own heart. This duality, wisdom and weakness, power and loss, is what makes him so human and so timeless. In this video, we will peel back the layers of Merlin's story tracing him from the shadows of history into the heart of myth. We will ask who Merlin truly was, not only as a legendary wizard, but as a prophetic voice shaped by the struggles of his age. We will explore his role as mentor-builder of kingdoms, seer of destinies, and tragic prisoner of fate. And most importantly, we will connect Merlin's story to the deeper patterns found in scripture and prophecy, where the rise and fall of kings is always accompanied by the voice of the prophet calling them back to a higher vision. Merlin is not just a wizard of old tales. He is a reminder that wisdom is costly, that destiny is not without sacrifice, and that even in myth we hear echoes of eternal truth. By the time we reach the end of this journey, Merlin will no longer appear as a distant character wrapped in legend, but as a figure whose story illuminates the very nature of prophecy leadership and the human longing for guidance in times of chaos. He is a bridge between the wild forests of Britain and the sacred stories of the Bible, between myth and revelation, between the shadows of the past and the questions of our present. This is the full story of Merlin, the legendary wizard of Arthurian mythology, and it begins now. To understand the story of Merlin, we must first enter the fractured world from which his legend emerged. When the Roman Empire withdrew its legions from Britain in the early 5th century, the island was left exposed to chaos. Once a proud province of Rome, with its roads, villas, and military fortresses, Britain suddenly found itself without the infrastructure and authority that had maintained order for centuries. The withdrawal was not a clean break. It left behind ruins, abandoned cities, and a population struggling to redefine its identity. Into this vacuum stepped local warlords, tribal chieftains, and foreign invaders, each vying for dominance over a land that no longer had a central power. This was not merely a political crisis, it was a spiritual and cultural one. As well, for the old gods of the Celts lingered in the memory of the people, while Christianity, introduced during Roman rule, fought to establish itself as the new guiding faith. It is in this crucible of transformation that the seeds of Merlin's legend began to grow. Imagine the ordinary villager of post-Roman Britain. Their Roman rulers gone, their lands raided by Saxons, their villages at the mercy of local strongmen. They lived in fear, but also in expectation, sensing that the land itself demanded a new story, a new protector, a new kind of leadership. Legends are not born in times of stability. They rise in moments when the human imagination strains to make sense of collapse. Thus, Merlin emerges not merely as a character of myth, but as a figure born of necessity, embodying the deep human need for guidance and hope in an age of shadows. The political backdrop of this period cannot be overstated. The Anglo-Saxons arrived from across the sea, settling in waves that threatened to erase the Celtic culture that had thrived for centuries. The Britons resisted, but disunity was their greatest weakness. Each small kingdom fought for survival, while whispers of a coming leader who would unite the land began to circulate in oral tradition. The figure of Arthur would one day embody that hope. But Arthur himself needed a prophet, someone to define his destiny before the people, someone who could give divine weight to his crown. This is where Merlin enters not as a mere counselor, but as the essential bridge between fractured tribes and a vision of unity. Without Merlin, Arthur might have remained an obscure warlord lost to history. With him, Arthur became a messianic figure of kingship. But to grasp Merlin's meaning, we must also consider the spiritual battlefield of the age. Christianity had begun its spread in Britain centuries earlier, but its roots were shallow compared to the enduring traditions of the Druids and the old gods. People still looked to sacred groves, to omens in the stars, and to wild prophets who spoke from the forests. Merlin himself was said to embody both worlds learned in prophecy and visions, yet also portrayed by later Christian chroniclers as a man touched by divine wisdom. This tension reflects the transitional soul of Britain itself, caught between pagan memory and Christian future, between superstition and revelation. The presence of such a figure would resonate deeply with people searching for meaning. He became a living metaphor for a nation that did not yet know whether it was pagan or Christian Roman, or native lost, or redeemed. It is also important to remember that legends are shaped not only by events, but by the pens of those who record them. The earliest accounts of Merlin, particularly in the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth, were written centuries after the events they describe, drawing from older oral traditions, but framing them for a medieval Christian audience. Geoffrey took fragments of stories about a wild prophet, a boy with no father, and a sage, who counseled kings and wove them into a single character who could stand alongside Arthur. His creation of Merlin was not fiction in the modern sense, but rather myth-making in the ancient sense, a process of taking scattered truths and symbols and binding them into a figure who could embody the soul of a people. Merlin, therefore, is both real and unreal, perhaps based on historical druids, prophets, or wise men, but ultimately transformed into a symbol larger than any individual life. The historical backdrop of post-Roman Britain gives us the key to understanding why Merlin's story mattered. It was not simply a tale of magic and wonder, but an answer to the deepest anxieties of a nation in turmoil. He was the prophet of a people who felt abandoned, the sage who pointed to a future kingdom when all seemed lost, the voice that promised there was order in the chaos. Whether he truly lived as a single man or not is secondary to the truth he represents, that in every age of collapse, humanity longs for a figure who can speak destiny into the void. Merlin's story is the story of Britain's rebirth after Rome, a rebirth that could only come through vision prophecy and the guiding hand of a mysterious wizard who would never truly die in the imagination of the world. The origins of Merlin are shrouded in mystery, woven with threads of myth prophecy and theological tension that reveal as much about the anxieties of medieval society as they do about the figure himself. Unlike Arthur, whose birth is tied to the manipulations of kings and knights, Merlin's conception carries a sense of cosmic disturbance. In some of the oldest stories, Merlin is described as the son of no earthly father, born of a mortal woman, who was visited not by a man of flesh and blood, but by a spirit or demon. Chroniclers of the Middle Ages, particularly Christian monks, painted this story with caution to them. Merlin's very existence was proof of a spiritual paradox. Was he a child of darkness conceived by an incubus to sow chaos in the world? Or was his life redirected by divine providence so that even what was meant for evil became an instrument of prophecy and wisdom? In this tension lies the haunting power of Merlin's legend. He is both feared and revered, a bridge between the sacred and the forbidden. To understand why such a story emerged, we must look at the way medieval minds viewed the world. The concept of a fatherless child, one marked by supernatural origins, had deep resonance in both pagan and Christian traditions. In pagan lore, heroes often arrived in the world with strange or miraculous births, signaling that they were destined for greatness. In Christian thought, the echo of the virgin birth of Christ hovered over all such stories, casting a long shadow of both inspiration and suspicion. Merlin's origins mimic this paradox. Like Christ, he has no earthly father. Yet unlike Christ, his conception is stained with demonic association. This allowed writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth to play with the dual nature of Merlin. He is not purely holy, nor purely evil, but a figure of tension, who carries within him the battle between light and darkness. The tale of his childhood also reinforces this sense of otherworldly identity. According to legend, when still a boy, Merlin astonished elders by revealing secrets about the future. In Geoffrey's account, he confronted the tyrant Vortigern, who was attempting to build a fortress, but watched it collapse again and again. The king's counselors told him to find a child with no father and sacrifice him to steady the foundations. Merlin was brought forth as this child. Yet instead of being a victim, he revealed the hidden truth beneath the ground. Were two dragons, one red and one white, locked in combat. Their battle symbolized the struggle between the native Britons and the invading Saxons. This prophetic vision not only saved Merlin's life, but also marked him as a seer whose insight came from forces beyond the understanding of ordinary men. Here, the child born of shadow becomes the one who speaks the truth no king or elder can perceive. This story also reveals something deeper about the way people projected their fears and hopes onto Merlin. The collapsing fortress represented the instability of the age, and the hidden dragons symbolized the unseen spiritual and political battles shaping their destiny. Merlin, as the child prophet, emerged as the one who could uncover what was hidden not by human knowledge, but by supernatural perception. For medieval audiences, this placed him in the company of biblical figures like Daniel, who interpreted the dreams of kings, or Joseph, who foresaw famine in Egypt. Yet Merlin was never fully trusted. His demonic heritage made him suspect, even as his words proved true. This contradiction is essential to his legend. He is both an outsider and a savior, one whose very strangeness gives him authority. The stories of his origins, also connect Merlin to the older Celtic traditions of the wild man or seer of the woods. In some accounts, Merlin's birth and youth tie him not only to demons, but to nature itself, as though he were conceived to carry the raw, untamed power of the earth. His later madness in the forest, his communion with animals, and his prophetic trances all stem from this primal identity. The people of Britain caught between Roman order and Saxon invasion may have found in Merlin a figure who embodied both the chaos of the wilderness and the possibility of divine guidance. He was not fully of this world, and because of that, he could see beyond it. In the end, the origins of Merlin are less about a single miraculous birth and more about the symbolic truth of who he was meant to be. By giving him a demonic father and a mortal mother, storytellers made him the child of two worlds, the realm of heaven and the shadows of the abyss. His role in legend is to wrestle with that duality, using his gifts for prophecy and wisdom to shape the destiny of Britain, while always carrying the suspicion that his power might one day consume him. This paradox made him irresistible to storytellers, theologians, and audiences alike. He was not the safe, sanitized wizard of later fairy tales, but a dangerous prophet whose very birth reminded people that wisdom is never free. It is always bought with tension, fear, and the weight of destiny. When we move beyond the shadow of Merlin's mysterious birth and childhood, the figure that emerges most vividly in the chronicles is not just a wizard, but a prophet. More than spells or incantations, it was his visions of the future that set him apart and made him indispensable to kings and rulers. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, Merlin is portrayed as a man whose foresight could pierce through the veil of time, revealing both the immediate fate of kingdoms and the distant destinies of nations yet unborn. This role as prophet rather than magician is crucial to understanding his true place in legend, for it transforms him from entertainer into seer, from trickster into one who speaks on behalf of a higher order. To the medieval imagination, prophecy carried immense weight. It was the thread that bound heaven to earth, giving men glimpses of divine providence in a world otherwise lost in chaos. The story of the two dragons under Vortigern's collapsing tower already revealed Merlin's prophetic gifts in his youth. But as he grew older, his visions expanded in scope and seriousness. He was said to predict the coming of Arthur, the unity of the Britons under a rightful king, and even the eventual downfall of that golden age. His prophecies often came in riddles cloaked in symbolic language that left listeners both awed and unsettled. Like the visions of Ezekiel or the dreams interpreted by Daniel, Merlin's words were never straightforward. They demanded interpretation, and in their ambiguity lay both hope and dread. A prophecy from Merlin could lift a ruler to power, but it could also sow fear of inevitable downfall. In this sense, Merlin mirrors the biblical prophet. Both reveal truths too heavy for ordinary men to bear, truths that kings might try to ignore, but could never fully escape. One of the most striking features of Merlin's prophetic tradition is the way it echoes the apocalyptic imagery found in Scripture. In some medieval texts, Merlin speaks of beasts rising from the Sea of Kingdoms, clashing like storms, and of a final reckoning that will reshape the land. These visions, though framed in the language of British myth, carry the same symbolic resonance as the Book of Revelation. For audiences steeped in biblical imagery, Merlin's voice sounded familiar, a prophet standing outside the halls of power, speaking in riddles that nonetheless rang with divine urgency. This is one of the reasons he was never fully dismissed as a mere sorcerer. His words carried too much resemblance to the prophetic tradition that lay at the heart of Christian scripture. Yet prophecy is a double-edged gift. To see the future is to carry the burden of inevitability, and many stories of Merlin dwell on the weight this placed upon him. He was not a triumphant prophet basking in the glory of fulfilled predictions, but a haunted man who foresaw tragedy as often as triumph. He could rejoice at Arthur's rise, but he also knew that betrayal and downfall awaited Camelot. He could celebrate the Round Table's vision of unity, but he also foresaw the seeds of division that would tear it apart. This tragic element aligns Merlin with biblical prophets like Jeremiah, who wept over the fate of Jerusalem, or Isaiah, who spoke of both judgment and hope. To prophesy was not to wield power lightly. It was to carry the sorrow of knowing what others refused to see. The rulers who sought Merlin's counsel often did so with a mixture of reverence and fear. Kings wanted his visions when they promised victory, but dreaded them when they hinted at downfall. This ambivalence ensured that Merlin's relationship with power was never simple. He was close enough to influence destiny, yet distant enough to remain untamed, a man whose allegiance seemed not to any single throne, but to the higher order of providence itself. In this way, he resembled the prophets of Israel, who stood outside the palace walls to remind kings that their crowns were not eternal, that their authority was borrowed from God, and that they, too, could fall. Merlin's role was not to flatter rulers, but to confront them with the uncomfortable truth that history itself was guided by forces beyond their control. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Merlin as a prophet is how his words outlived him. Medieval readers treated his prophecies as if they were still unfolding in their own times, applying them to wars, invasions, and struggles centuries after Merlin was said to have lived. This enduring relevance shows how deeply his voice had sunk into the imagination of Britain. He was less a historical man and more a timeless prophet, whose visions seemed to echo across generations. In this, again, we see a reflection of biblical prophecy, where words spoken long before still resonate as if they were meant for today. The legend of Merlin thrives because his prophecy was never just about the past. It was about the eternal struggle of kingdoms, the rise and fall of leaders, and the hope for a divine order to break through human chaos. Merlin as prophet reveals the essence of his legend. He was not merely a magician of tricks, but a seer who spoke destiny. His role was to remind kings and commoners alike that history was not random, that beneath the surface of war and politics lay a deeper pattern guided by forces greater than any one man. Whether inspired by pagan seers, Christian prophecy, or a blend of both, Merlin's voice endures because it touched something universal, the longing to know the future and the fear of what it might bring. In his riddles and visions, we hear not only the legend of a wizard Bast, but the cry of humanity itself, searching for order in the storm of time. If Merlin's gift of prophecy marked him as a figure of awe, it was his role in shaping the destiny of King Arthur that secured his place at the heart of Arthurian legend. The relationship between Merlin and Arthur is not one of a passive counselor advising from the shadows, but of a prophet midwife delivering a destiny into the world. Every great king in legend requires a guide, and in the figure of Merlin, we see the archetype of the mentor who carries secret knowledge and divine vision, steering the chosen one toward his appointed role. Without Merlin, Arthur's name might never have risen above the countless warlords of post-Roman Britain. With him, Arthur became not just a warrior, but a king ordained by Providence, a figure who would embody the hope of an entire nation. The story begins even before Arthur's birth. Merlin is credited with orchestrating the circumstances that brought Arthur into the world. When Uther Pendragon lusted after Igraine, the wife of Duke Gorlois, it was Merlin who used his arts to disguise Uther, enabling him to enter Tintagel Castle and conceive Arthur. For modern audiences, this tale is unsettling, filled with questions of morality and manipulation. But for medieval storytellers, it demonstrated the inevitability of destiny. Merlin was not simply a servant of Uther's desire. He was the agent ensuring that the child destined to unite Britain would be born. In this strange and morally ambiguous episode, we see the paradox of Merlin's role, a prophet whose actions sometimes seem questionable, yet whose ultimate aim is the fulfillment of a higher vision. Just as biblical figures like Samson or David were born under extraordinary circumstances, so too was Arthur, and Merlin was the instrument of his coming. Once Arthur was born, Merlin became his protector and secret guardian. He arranged for the infant king to be hidden away, raised in obscurity, until the time was right for his destiny to be revealed. This motif of the hidden child echoes throughout myth and scripture. Moses hidden in the reeds of the Nile, Christ concealed from Herod's massacre, and now Arthur kept safe until the fullness of time. Merlin's foresight ensured that the boy who was destined to rule would be preserved from the dangers of court intrigue, growing in strength and character before stepping into his role. Here, Merlin is not merely a wizard, but a steward of Providence, safeguarding the vessel of Britain's future. The next great moment in their shared story is the sword in the stone, one of the most iconic images of Arthurian lore. According to tradition, it was Merlin who arranged for the sword to be set in stone, a test that no man could pass except the rightful king chosen by divine authority. While others struggled in vain, Arthur drew the sword effortlessly, proving his legitimacy before the people. This act transformed him from an unknown youth into a messianic figure destined to unify the land. The symbolism is clear, just as prophets in the Bible anointed kings with oil, marking them as chosen by God. So Merlin used the sword as a sacrament of kingship. In this way, Merlin functioned as priest and prophet, ensuring that Arthur's rule was not merely political, but divinely ordained. Yet Merlin's guidance did not end with Arthur's coronation. Throughout the early years of his reign, Merlin served as counselor, strategist, and visionary. He advised Arthur on matters of justice, on the establishment of the Round Table, and on the deeper purpose of kingship itself. Where other kings ruled by force, Arthur ruled by destiny, and that destiny was shaped and spoken into being by Merlin's wisdom. Their relationship was not always one of agreement. Merlin often warned Arthur of dangers that the young king ignored. It was a partnership in which prophecy and power worked hand in hand. Arthur wielded the sword, but Merlin carried the vision. Together they forged a kingdom that would be remembered as a golden age, even as Merlin foresaw the shadows that would one day fall upon it. The story of Merlin and Arthur resonates because it reflects a universal truth. No leader rises alone. Behind every throne stands a voice of wisdom, sometimes welcomed, sometimes resisted, but always essential. In Arthur's case, that voice was Merlin the prophet, who saw his destiny before he was born, and who guided him through the trials of youth into the fullness of kingship. This bond between prophet and king echoes the relationship between Samuel and David in the Bible, or Nathan confronting David with divine truth. Kings may wield power, but prophets remind them that their rule is subject to a higher order. Arthur's greatness lies not only in his sword or his courage, but in the fact that he listened at least for a time to the guidance of Merlin. By tying Arthur's destiny so closely to Merlin's hand, the legend makes a profound statement true. Kingship is never merely the triumph of force, but the fulfillment of prophecy. Merlin's role in Arthur's rise teaches us that history is shaped not only by warriors and battles, but by visionaries who see beyond the moment, who dare to believe that destiny itself can be revealed. For medieval audiences, this gave Arthur's reign divine legitimacy. For us today, it reveals the enduring archetype of the mentor who shapes the hero. Without Merlin, Arthur is just another name in the dust of history. With him, he becomes the king whose story still captures the imagination of the world. The rise of Arthur to the throne was only the beginning of his legend, for the true glory of his reign came not merely from battle victories, but from the creation of Camelot, the shining kingdom that became a symbol of justice, order, and divine purpose. And at the heart of that vision was Merlin. The wizard's influence extended beyond the battlefield into the very architecture of Arthur's reign, shaping a kingdom that would become mythologized as a reflection of heaven on earth. If Arthur was the sword, Merlin was the blueprint, the architect of a vision that sought to turn chaos into harmony and tribal warfare into unity under one crown. Camelot was never just a city, it was an idea. While its location has long been debated, whether it was based on a real fortress or entirely a work of imagination, the concept it carried was unmistakable. Camelot stood as a place where the ideals of chivalry, equality, and honor were enshrined in stone. And who gave voice to those ideals? It was Merlin the prophet who whispered to Arthur that his rule must be more than conquest, that it must reflect the justice of heaven. According to legend, Merlin not only counseled Arthur on matters of state, but also had a hand in the design of the Round Table itself. Unlike a long rectangular table that exalted a head and subjugated the rest, the Round Table symbolized equality. Every knight had an equal place, no seat above another, no rank beyond that of service and honor. This radical vision transformed kingship from mere hierarchy into something closer to covenant, and that shift bore the unmistakable mark of Merlin's prophetic influence. The Round Table carries profound biblical echoes. In Scripture, covenants are sealed not in dominance, but in fellowship. When Jesus gathered his disciples for the Last Supper, He broke bread with them at a shared table, establishing not hierarchy, but community under God. The Round Table mirrors this principle, presenting a kingdom where the highest calling is not domination, but service, where power is shared among those who seek righteousness. Merlin's wisdom infused Arthur's court with this spiritual depth, making Camelot not just a political capital, but a sacred experiment in just governance. To medieval audiences steeped in Christian teaching, this was not mere coincidence, but deliberate symbolism. Camelot was the earthly attempt to mirror the divine kingdom, and Merlin was its prophet designer. But Camelot was also born in tension. For every knight who swore allegiance to the Round Table, there were others who resented the leveling of status. Equality, after all, is always a threat to those who benefit from hierarchy. Merlin foresaw these divisions, warning Arthur that the very ideals that made Camelot great could also become its vulnerability. A kingdom that seeks perfection in a fallen world is destined to face betrayal, and so it would prove in time. Yet this does not diminish Merlin's role. Rather, it underscores the prophetic truth that his vision was not meant to create a flawless utopia, but to provide a glimpse of what humanity could strive for. The imagery of Camelot as a shining city has endured precisely because it appeals to something eternal in the human soul. It is the same longing expressed in the biblical vision of the New Jerusalem, a city where justice reigns and God dwells among his people. In Arthurian myth, Merlin channels this longing into the earthly realm, fashioning a court where knights dedicate themselves to a higher code, where the weak are defended, and where truth is honored. Even if Camelot fell, the dream it embodied lived on. Just as Israel's earthly kingdom fell, but the covenant continued in the hearts of its people. In this way, Merlin's creation was not wasted, but eternal, carried forward by every retelling of the Arthurian story. Merlin's hand in the creation of Camelot also reveals a deeper truth about leadership power. Alone cannot build a kingdom that endures. Armies may conquer, but only vision sustains. Arthur's strength as a warrior won him battles, but it was Merlin's foresight that gave his reign lasting meaning. Camelot was more than walls and towers. It was the embodiment of a covenant between king knights and people. This covenantal vision was Merlin's greatest gift, a prophetic architecture that continues to inspire imaginations centuries later. Thus, the creation of Camelot stands as one of the crowning achievements of Merlin's influence. It was his wisdom that transformed Arthur's reign from a fleeting military triumph into a story that still echoes with spiritual depth. By shaping the ideals of Camelot and giving form to the Round Table, Merlin ensured that Arthur's kingdom would not only be remembered in history, but revered as a reflection of humanity's highest hopes. Camelot may have crumbled in time, but the vision endures, a light shining from the mists of legend, forever reminding us of what could be when prophecy and kingship walk hand in hand. Among all the figures who orbit around Merlin's story, none is more mysterious, alluring, or fateful than the Lady of the Lake, known in different traditions as Nimue Vivian or Ninian. Her role in the Arthurian cycle is layered with complexity. She is at once a giver of gifts, a temptress, a teacher, and ultimately the one who brings about Merlin's downfall. In her, we encounter one of the central themes of the legend: the interplay between masculine and feminine powers, between wisdom and desire, between the prophet who sees all and the woman who becomes the veil that blinds him. To understand Merlin's destiny, we must examine his relationship with the Lady of the Lake, for it is here that his story becomes less about the prophecy of nations and more about the vulnerability of the human heart. The Lady of the Lake is perhaps most famous for bestowing upon Arthur the sword. Excalibur the weapon that marked him as a king, chosen by destiny. But before she enters Arthur's story, she enters Merlin's. Their relationship begins when she seeks his knowledge, and he, fascinated by her beauty and spirit, agrees to teach her the secrets of his arts. It is here that the paradox begins. Merlin, the wisest prophet of the age, who counseled kings and foresaw the rise and fall of empires, allowed himself to be captivated by a single woman. He was not tricked by force, but willingly ensnared by love, or perhaps by his own pride in thinking he could guide her without being undone. In teaching her, he gave away pieces of himself, for knowledge is never just power. It is also vulnerability. The dynamic between Merlin and Nimue reflects a profound archetypal tension. On one hand, she represents the feminine principle of mystery, enchantment, and renewal. Water has always symbolized life and rebirth, and as the Lady of the Lake, Nimue embodies this sacred flow. On the other hand, her role as Merlin's undoing carries the shadow of temptation and betrayal. She is both muse and jailer, both student and conqueror. To some medieval writers, she was a dangerous sorceress who trapped the prophet out of ambition. To others, she was the necessary counterpart, the one who ensured that even Merlin could not stand outside the cycle of desire and consequence. This story also resonates with biblical echoes. Samson, for example, was the mightiest of judges, gifted with strength from God. Yet he was undone by Delilah, whose persistence stripped him of his secret and his freedom. Like Samson, Merlin was not defeated on the battlefield, but in the intimacy of love, where his wisdom could not shield him from his own human longing. The lesson here is not that women are villains, but that even prophets and heroes carry within them the seeds of their own downfall, often through the very gifts that define them. Merlin's gift of wisdom and teaching became the instrument of his captivity. Accounts of Merlin's imprisonment vary. Some say Nimue trapped him in a cave, others that she sealed him within a crystal tower, still others that she bound him with invisible chains of enchantment. But all versions agree on one point. Merlin, the man who saw the future, could not prevent his own fate. This irony is central to his legend. Prophets may see destiny, but they cannot always escape it. In his imprisonment, Merlin becomes less the triumphant guide of kings and more the tragic sage silenced before his time. His fate warns us that even the greatest wisdom cannot erase the vulnerability of the human heart. And yet there is another way to read this relationship, not as a betrayal, but as a necessary transformation. Nimue did not kill Merlin. She preserved him, placing him in a state of suspended existence, a living tomb that is also a sanctuary. Some traditions say he still sleeps, awaiting the day when Britain most needs him. If so, then Nimue's act was not pure malice, but part of a larger destiny. She became the guardian of his wisdom, holding him in the realm of mystery until the appointed hour. In this interpretation, their relationship is less about defeat and more about balance, a union of opposites where love and fate intertwine. The story of Merlin and the Lady of the Lake is powerful because it humanizes the prophet. He is no longer the untouchable wizard guiding kings with serene authority. He is a man who loved, who trusted, and who suffered for it. His downfall reminds us that no matter how exalted our gifts, we are all bound by the same fragile cords of longing and vulnerability. And yet, even in his silence, Merlin's influence endures. His teachings live on in Arthur in the Round Table and in the very ideals of Camelot. His story with Nimue is not the end of his legacy, but the deepening of it, reminding us that wisdom always walks hand in hand with weakness, and that even prophets are not immune to the mysteries of love. When people today hear the name Merlin, The first image that often comes to mind is that of a wizard, cloaked in robes, staff in hand, summoning storms or conjuring illusions. But to truly understand what magic meant in the age of Arthur, we must set aside modern notions of fantasy and return to the medieval imagination, where magic, miracle, and mystery were deeply intertwined. In the world of Arthurian legend, magic was not simply a tool for entertainment or spectacle. It was a language of power, a way of interpreting and shaping reality, and often an echo of the divine. For Merlin, magic was inseparable from prophecy, from wisdom, and from the larger drama of a nation struggling to reconcile the old pagan traditions with the rising tide of Christianity. His sorcery was not about breaking natural laws, but about revealing the unseen laws that governed destiny. In Celtic traditions, the line between magic and spirituality was thin. Druids, bards, and seers were believed to possess the ability to commune with the natural and supernatural realms, drawing wisdom from trees, rivers, and stars. When early audiences heard of Merlin's abilities, they would not have imagined him pulling rabbits from hats, but rather entering trances, deciphering omens, and channeling the forces of nature. His spells were acts of alignment with hidden truths. For example, the story of the dragons beneath Vortigern's tower is not a tale of a man manipulating nature, but of a seer who understood that natural phenomena concealed symbolic realities. Merlin's magic was revelatory, rather than manipulative, exposing what was already true but hidden from ordinary eyes. Yet in the Christianized world of the Middle Ages, the idea of magic carried suspicion. The Bible warned against sorcery, divination, and communication with spirits. To reconcile this, medieval chroniclers framed Merlin's powers with ambiguity. Was he a sorcerer tainted by demonic blood? Or was he a prophet whose visions ultimately served divine purposes? This tension allowed his story to occupy a liminal space. To some, his enchantments were dangerous, a reminder of forbidden arts. To others, they were miracles in disguise, expressions of wisdom that came from God. This duality mirrors the very struggle of Arthur's Britain, a society caught between its pagan past and its Christian future. In Merlin's magic, audiences could see both the threat of old ways and the promise of higher truth. The Arthurian world also imagined magic as a force embedded in sacred objects and landscapes. Excalibur itself, given by the Lady of the Lake, was more than a sword. It was a covenantal symbol, carrying with it the authority of kingship. The scabbard of Excalibur, which protected Arthur from harm, was as enchanted as the blade. The Holy Grail, though rooted in Christian symbolism, entered the legends with an aura of mystical wonder, a vessel that transcended earthly explanation. Merlin's presence among these enchanted symbols tied him directly to the sacred destiny of Arthur's court. He was not merely a user of magic, but the interpreter of it, the one who revealed the meaning behind the mysteries. Without Merlin, the Grail would be a cup, the sword merely steel. With him, they became divine instruments woven into the fabric of destiny. It is important to note that Merlin's magic was also political. His visions and enchantments shaped the decisions of kings, influenced battles, and legitimized Arthur's authority. In a world where literacy was rare and most people relied on oral tradition, and symbolic ritual magic functioned as a form of communication between heaven and earth. Merlin became the mediator of that language, ensuring that Arthur's reign was not grounded only in brute force, but in spiritual authority. In this sense, his role resembled the prophets of Israel, who anointed kings and declared God's will. Just as Samuel guided Saul and David, so Merlin guided Arthur, but through the language of enchantment rather than direct divine command. What makes the Arthurian world so captivating is that its magic never feels entirely fictional. Instead, it reflects humanity's attempt to make sense of mystery. For the medieval mind, the natural and supernatural realms overlapped constantly. A storm might be weather, but it might also be a sign of divine judgment. A dream might be mere fancy, or it might carry the voice of God. Merlin embodied this worldview, living in the space where every natural event concealed a supernatural truth. His magic was not about escaping reality, but about deepening it, reminding people that the world is charged with meaning far beyond what the eye can see. Thus, when we speak of Merlin's magic, we are not speaking of stage tricks or childish illusions. We are speaking of the prophetic imagination, the ability to see destiny written in the fabric of the world and to act in accordance with it. This is why Merlin remains such a potent figure. His sorcery is not escapism, but engagement, not a departure from truth, but an unveiling of it. In him, the Arthurian world's understanding of magic becomes clear. It is the mysterious overlap of heaven and earth, a force that can both guide and endanger, but always reveals that history is more than mere chance. Among the many strands of Arthurian legend, none shines brighter than the story of the Holy Grail, that mysterious vessel said to carry divine power, eternal life, and the ultimate truth of the Christian mystery. The Grail is the symbol that lifts Arthurian romance out of mere chivalric adventure and into the realm of spiritual pilgrimage. And while the Knights of the Round Table are remembered as the seekers of this holy relic, Merlin's presence looms quietly but decisively behind the quest. Though he does not ride in search of the Grail himself, he is the architect of the vision, the prophet who points others toward the hidden treasure that lies not just in a sacred object, but in the transformation of the soul. Without Merlin, the Grail would be a cup lost in myth. With him, it became the central mystery of Arthur's kingdom. The origins of the Grail legend are complex, blending Celtic myths of magical cauldrons with Christian ideas of the chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper. Merlin stood at the crossroads of these traditions, serving as the interpreter who fused pagan memory with Christian revelation. He prepared Arthur's knights for the Grail by teaching them that their battles were not merely for land and power, but for holiness itself. The Round Table, which he had helped to establish, was more than a council of warriors. It was a spiritual fellowship, a gathering of men who in their unity reflected the disciples gathered at Christ's table. In this way, Merlin transformed chivalry into a form of discipleship, preparing the ground for the Grail quest to unfold. When the Grail first appears in Arthur's court, carried in silence and mystery, the knights are struck with awe, but they do not understand what it means. It is Merlin who provides the framework for its interpretation. He tells them that the Grail is not merely a relic to be possessed, but a divine mystery to be sought with purity of heart. Here, his role mirrors that of the biblical prophets who prepared Israel for the coming of the Messiah, pointing beyond themselves to a greater reality, urging their people to cleanse their hearts before they could receive God's promise. Merlin, in essence, became the John the Baptist of the Arthurian world, preparing the way for the ultimate revelation. The quest for the Grail is marked by both glory and tragedy. Many knights set out, but only the purest Galahad Percival, and in some versions, boors are able to attain even a vision of it. Others falter undone by pride, lust, or doubt. Merlin foresaw these failures, warning that not all who sat at the Round Table were worthy of the holy vision. Yet his warnings were not meant to discourage. They were meant to refine, to remind the knights that the Grail could not be won by strength of arms, but only by the strength of the soul. Just as the prophets of the Old Testament declared that sacrifice without righteousness was empty, so Merlin declared that knighthood without purity was powerless. His words cast the Grail quest as a spiritual trial, not a military campaign. The imagery of the Grail resonates deeply with Christian theology. As the chalice of Christ, it represents the blood of the covenant, the promise of eternal life. To seek it is to seek union with God. By weaving the Grail into the fabric of Arthur's kingdom, Merlin ensured that the story of Camelot would not merely be about earthly glory, but about humanity's highest longing. In this way, the Grail quest turned Camelot into a reflection of the church itself, a fellowship of flawed but striving souls, journeying toward the ultimate mystery of redemption. Merlin's role as the one who unveiled this truth cemented his place not just as a wizard, but as a prophet of salvation. Yet the Grail quest also marked the beginning of the end for Camelot. The pursuit fractured the Round Table, scattering knights across the land and exposing their weaknesses. When the Grail was finally glimpsed, it was only by those who could leave the world behind. And in their departure, Camelot lost some of its greatest champions. Merlin, who had foreseen both the glory and the cost, accepted this as inevitable. The Grail was never meant to be a trophy for Arthur's kingdom. It was meant to point beyond the kingdom itself, to remind all who sought it that earthly glory fades, but divine truth endures. This bittersweet truth is what gives the Grail story its haunting power. In the end, Merlin's connection to the Grail is not about possession, but about vision. He was the prophet who taught the knights what to seek, who revealed that the greatest battles are fought within the soul, and who framed the Grail as the symbol of humanity's highest destiny. His role in the Grail quest shows us that he was never merely the magician of spectacle, but the seer of eternal truths. Through him, the Arthurian world became not only a stage of knights and battles, but a cathedral of myth where every quest pointed toward the divine. If prophecy gave Merlin his authority, and the Grail gave his story its sacred depth, it was his profound relationship with nature that grounded his legend in the raw earth itself. Unlike the knights of Arthur's court, who thrived in castles and halls of stone, Merlin was often portrayed as a figure of the wilderness, a man as much at home among trees, rivers, and animals as he was in the chambers of kings. This aspect of his story is more than a colorful detail. It reveals the heart of who Merlin was. His wisdom did not come solely from books or visions, but from a deep communion with the natural world, which he treated as both teacher and temple. In him, we see the ancient archetype of the wild prophet, the man who retreats from human society to gain a clearer vision of truth. In some traditions, Merlin is depicted as a wild man of the woods, after suffering madness from the horrors of war. Retreating into the forests of Caledonia, he lived among the animals clothed in leaves and speaking in riddles. Yet even in this apparent madness, he displayed uncanny knowledge of plants, animals, and the hidden rhythms of the earth. Medieval audiences would have recognized in this figure echoes of older Celtic seers, druids, who sought wisdom through nature, and also resonances with biblical prophets like Elijah or John the Baptist, who withdrew into wilderness to hear the voice of God. Nature in this view was not chaos to be conquered, but a sacred text to be read, and Merlin was its interpreter. Merlin's bond with animals is another striking feature of his legend. Birds were said to bring him messages, stags were his companions, and even wild beasts responded to his presence with gentleness. This imagery carries symbolic weight. In biblical tradition, Adam was charged with naming the animals, signifying humanity's role as steward of creation. In Christian hagiographies, saints like Francis of Assisi were remembered for their harmony with animals, signs of their closeness to divine order. Merlin's rapport with creatures echoes this theme. He embodied a lost harmony between humanity and the natural world, a state in which wisdom meant not domination, but communion. Plants and herbs also figured prominently in Merlin's lore. He was believed to know the healing properties of roots and leaves, and his knowledge of natural medicine marked him as both magician and healer. To medieval minds, this blurred the line between science and sorcery, for medicine itself was seen as a kind of mystery. Yet through Merlin's knowledge of plants, we glimpse an ancient understanding that creation itself carries divine wisdom, that healing flows through the earth if one has eyes to see it. Here again, Merlin stands as a liminal figure halfway between pagan herbalist and Christian prophet, one who draws power from creation without severing its connection to the Creator. Merlin's time in the wilderness also deepened his prophetic identity. The solitude of the forest stripped away human distractions, leaving him open to visions that city dwellers could never perceive. This recalls how Moses encountered God in the wilderness of Sinai, or how Christ fasted in the desert before beginning his ministry. The wilderness in both myth and scripture is the crucible of transformation, and Merlin's retreats into nature symbolize his role as one who steps outside human order to receive wisdom for humanity's sake. His madness, often portrayed in these stories, may not be madness at all, but the ecstatic state of one who has glimpsed truths too vast for ordinary minds. The tension between court and forest is a recurring theme in Merlin's story. At Camelot, he was the counselor of kings, shaping laws and guiding destinies. In the wilderness, he was the untamed seer, listening to the voice of earth and sky. This dual existence gave his wisdom its unique power, for he carried both the authority of the prophet and the humility of the hermit. He was not confined to thrones or castles. His kingdom was the natural world, and from that wider perspective, he could see truths that rulers blinded by ambition could not. Merlin's relationship with nature also underscores a deeper message in Arthurian mythology, that humanity cannot sever itself from creation without losing its soul. Camelot may have been a shining city of justice, but its strength depended on the deeper harmony between man and the world around him. By embodying this harmony, Merlin became the conscience of Arthur's kingdom, reminding them that no court, however noble, could stand without respect for the laws written into the fabric of nature. His example continues to resonate today as modern audiences grapple with questions of ecology balance and humanity's role in the natural order. In the end, Merlin's communion with nature reveals that his wisdom was not only intellectual or spiritual, but ecological. He was a prophet of earth as well as of heaven, a man who understood that the destiny of nations was inseparable from the rhythms of rivers, forests, and skies. His legend teaches us that true wisdom listens not only to the voice of God, but to the whisper of creation, for the two are never in conflict. In the rustle of leaves and the cry of birds, Merlin heard the same truths he spoke to kings. Truths that remind us that humanity's fate is bound to the world it inhabits. One of the most haunting aspects of Merlin's legend is his descent into what later storytellers called madness. To the surface reader, this might seem like a fall from greatness. The prophet and counselor of kings, reduced to a raving hermit wandering the wilderness and speaking in riddles. Yet when examined more deeply, this so-called madness reveals itself not as weakness, but as transformation, a sacred trance through which Merlin accessed truths hidden from ordinary men. Like so many prophets and visionaries in history, he became a figure marked by both alienation and revelation, a man who seemed broken to the world, but who was in truth more awake to the deeper currents of reality than those who dismissed him. The stories often describe Merlin fleeing into the forest after witnessing the brutality of battle, particularly the slaughter at Arthurian, where his mind shattered under the weight of bloodshed. He abandoned society, clothed himself in leaves, and lived among beasts. To his contemporaries, this was madness, a rejection of human life. But to later interpreters, including poets and mystics, Merlin's retreat symbolized a prophetic calling. In stepping outside the structures of kings and courts, he entered into the raw heart of existence, a place where visions could erupt unfiltered by politics or human ambition. His madness was not a collapse, but an initiation. This interpretation resonates with biblical parallels. The prophet Ezekiel lay on his side for months, enacting symbolic prophecies that surely made him appear insane to those around him. Jeremiah wept and raged, calling down doom on Jerusalem, and was accused of treason and lunacy. Even Christ, when speaking of eating his flesh and drinking his blood, was considered mad by many listeners. To carry visions that disrupt ordinary perception is always to risk being labeled unbalanced. Merlin's madness belongs to this tradition. It was the cost of seeing too much, of bearing revelations too heavy for ordinary minds. The wilderness became the crucible of Merlin's visionary trances. Alone among trees and rivers, he slipped into states where past, present, and future dissolved into one continuous vision. In these moments, he was said to speak of great beasts rising and falling, of kings, yet unborn, of the collapse and rebirth of nations. His words, recorded in the so-called Prophecies of Merlin, are filled with strange symbols: dragons, lions, serpents, and storms. To the uninitiated, these sounded like the ramblings of a madman. Yet to those with ears to hear, they were riddles that contained glimpses of divine providence, warnings and promises hidden in metaphor. Just as the book of Revelation speaks in beasts and seals, so did Merlin his madness, producing visions that could not be expressed in ordinary speech. But why must wisdom appear as madness? The answer lies in the human condition. Most people are bound to the rhythms of survival, food, family, work, war. To see beyond these immediate concerns requires stepping outside the ordinary frame of mind, often at the cost of seeming unstable. The visionary breaks the conventions of speech and behavior because the truths he carries do not fit within them. For Merlin, madness was the outer cloak of a deeper sanity, the price of opening his soul to the currents of fate and eternity. His society could not understand this, and so cast him as mad, yet his visions continued to shape the destiny of Britain long after. The theme of madness also humanizes Merlin. For all his wisdom, he was not a cold, detached figure, immune to suffering. The horrors of war broke his heart, and his visions overwhelmed his mind. His retreat into the forest was an act of both despair and transcendence, reminding us that even prophets bear wounds. This makes his legend profoundly relatable. We too live in times of turmoil, where the weight of events can drive us to the edge of reason. Merlin shows us that even in such states of rupture, there is the possibility of deeper vision, that the breaking of the mind can open doors to the mysteries of God and nature. In the end, Merlin's madness was not the end of his story, but a new chapter of it. It freed him from the constraints of court life and allowed him to speak with a voice that was no longer tied to kings, but to eternity itself. His trances gave rise to prophecies that outlasted Arthur's reign visions, that medieval audiences believed still spoke to their own times. To call him mad was to misunderstand him. To call him prophet was closer to the truth. His life teaches us that wisdom sometimes comes clothed in strangeness, and that those who see most clearly are often the ones society cannot comprehend. While Merlin is often remembered as the private counselor of Arthur, his legend extends far beyond the walls of Camelot. He was not only a prophet for a single king, but a figure who in many stories shaped the destiny of entire nations. His influence is woven into the broader political and spiritual fabric of Britain, transforming him into a national prophet whose words echoed across generations. To understand this dimension of his character is to see how deeply his story embodies the universal longing for a guide who can steer whole peoples, not just individual rulers, through times of chaos. The tale of Vortigern and the collapsing tower is an early example of Merlin's impact on the fate of nations. When Vortigern sought to build his fortress, the earth itself resisted crumbling again and again until Merlin revealed the truth of the dragons battling beneath. The red dragon symbolizing the native Britons and the white dragon symbolizing the invading Saxons became a prophetic image of the struggle that would define Britain's future. This vision did not simply save a king from embarrassment, it gave an entire people a symbolic framework for their history, a way to understand their conflict as part of a larger cosmic drama. Here, Merlin emerges as more than a magician. He is the interpreter of destiny for a nation caught between survival and conquest. Later traditions credit Merlin with orchestrating the transfer of power from the chaotic rule of Vortigern to the more stable line of Uther Pendragon, and ultimately to Arthur. In this sense, he was not just a passive seer, but an active shaper of political order, guiding the transitions of power to ensure that the nation would not disintegrate into endless tribal warfare. By providing prophetic legitimacy to new rulers, he helped consolidate the fragile unity that Britain desperately needed. His role mirrors that of biblical prophets like Samuel, who anointed Saul and David not as kings of their own making, but as leaders chosen to embody God's will for Israel. In both cases, the prophet ensures that kingship is not merely political, but spiritual, binding the fate of the people to a higher vision. The shaping of nations through prophecy also reveals the burden of Merlin's role. His visions often contained not only hope, but warnings of decline and betrayal. He was said to have foreseen the fall of Camelot, even as he helped build its foundations. This duality, guiding a people to greatness while knowing their eventual collapse, aligns him with prophets like Jeremiah, who proclaimed both the promise of restoration and the inevitability of exile. Merlin's prophecies, filled with cryptic images of beasts, storms, and shifting thrones, were interpreted by later generations as speaking not only of Arthur's age, but of their own. In this way, his voice became timeless, continually shaping the identity of Britain through each retelling. Merlin's influence also transcended Britain. In some medieval traditions, he was credited with predicting events far beyond his homeland, speaking of the fates of other kingdoms and even the church itself. These prophecies reveal how mythmakers used his figure to make sense of Europe's shifting political landscape. Just as biblical prophets were invoked to explain and interpret historical upheavals, so Merlin was cast as a prophet whose words resonated across borders, a figure whose insight could explain the rise and fall of emperors and popes alike. His legend thus became a tool for understanding not only the destiny of a single nation, but the destiny of Christendom as a whole. One of the most fascinating aspects of Merlin's national role is how he embodies the collective hope of a people. When Britain faced chaos, the idea of a prophet who could see the pattern of events gave comfort and direction. Even after Arthur's death and the collapse of Camelot, stories persisted that Merlin had not truly died, but was waiting hidden away to return when Britain needed him most. This echoes the messianic expectation found in many cultures, the belief that a chosen one, or a prophet, will return in the nation's darkest hour. In Merlin, the Britons found not only a guide for their past, but a promise for their future. Ultimately, Merlin's story as the shaper of nations shows us that prophecy is never just about individuals. It is about giving whole peoples a way to understand themselves in relation to destiny, to see their struggles as part of a greater narrative. Merlin's visions legitimized kings' guided armies and gave symbolic meaning to wars and alliances. But more importantly, they offered the people a sense of purpose in the midst of chaos. Whether he truly lived as one man, or whether his image was built from fragments of many seers and storytellers, Merlin became the voice of a nation's soul. His legend teaches us that in every age of uncertainty, societies long for a prophet who can reveal that history is not random, but charged with meaning, and that even in defeat, there lies the seed of hope. Every great legend carries not only moments of triumph, but also the shadow of tragedy. And in Merlin's story, this shadow falls heavily across the later years of his life. For all his wisdom, his foresight, and his pivotal role in shaping the destiny of Arthur and Britain, Merlin does not end his days in glory. Instead, he is silenced, imprisoned, or hidden away, depending on the version of the tale. His tragedy lies not in being defeated by enemies on the battlefield, but in being undone by forces more subtle and intimate love betrayal and the inexorable weight of destiny. In this, Merlin becomes a profoundly human figure. He is not destroyed by ignorance or weakness alone, but by the very paradox of his gifts, the ability to see so much of the future, yet the inability to alter his own fate. One of the most enduring traditions is that of his entrapment by Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. Having given her his knowledge, Merlin found himself caught in the very spells he had taught, bound within an invisible prison of enchantment. Some stories say it was a cave, others a crystal tower, still others a tree where he sleeps in a kind of living death. No matter the version, the result is the same. The great prophet who once guided kings is confined and silenced. This image is haunting precisely because of its irony. Merlin, who could unravel the mysteries of destiny, who could summon dragons and foresee the rise and fall of kingdoms, could not prevent his own downfall at the hands of love. His end is not a battle, but a surrender, not a grand war, but a quiet, unescapable fate. This tragedy mirrors the pattern of so many prophets and sages in history. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern. John the Baptist beheaded Socrates, forced to drink poison. Wisdom rarely ends with applause. More often, it ends in silence. Merlin's imprisonment reflects this universal truth. Societies crave prophecy when it confirms their hopes, but they fear it when it exposes their flaws. And prophets themselves, no matter how strong, are still vulnerable to human desires and frailties. Merlin's love for Nimue was not a weakness of intellect, but of heart, a reminder that even the wisest are still human. His tragedy lies in being both more than a man, and yet fully a man, torn between vision and vulnerability. There is another interpretation, however, that gives his tragedy a deeper meaning. Some traditions suggest that Nimue did not trap Merlin out of malice, but out of necessity to preserve his wisdom until the appointed time when Britain would need him again. In this view, his imprisonment is not defeat, but transformation, a passage from active prophet to hidden guardian. Like King Arthur, who is said to sleep in Avalon until his return, Merlin too becomes a sleeping presence, waiting in silence for the moment when his voice will be required again. His tragedy then becomes a paradoxical hope. He is absent yet not gone, silenced, yet not dead. His story embodies the idea that wisdom once spoken cannot be destroyed. It simply waits veiled for rediscovery. The tragedy of Merlin also speaks to the tension between knowledge and power. For all his foresight, he could not change the inevitability of Camelot's fall. He could warn Arthur, he could shape the Round Table. He could even orchestrate the Grail quest. But he could not stop betrayal lust and pride from tearing the kingdom apart. This helplessness in the face of destiny is part of his sorrow. To see the future is not always a gift. Often it is a burden. Knowing what must come yet being unable to change it can break even the strongest soul. Merlin's silence, whether in madness or in imprisonment, may be read as the exhaustion of a prophet who has seen too much and borne too much. In the end, Merlin's tragedy is what makes him eternal. His story does not conclude with neat resolution, but with mystery. Did he die in his prison? Does he still sleep waiting to return? Was he defeated by love or preserved by it? These unanswered questions keep his legend alive, allowing each generation to reinterpret him in its own light. His tragedy gives him depth, transforming him from a flawless wizard into a figure who mirrors our own struggles to live with vision, but also with limitation to love, even when it wounds us to speak truth, even when it leads to silence. Thus, the tragedy of Merlin is not merely an end, but a mirror of the human condition. It reminds us that wisdom does not shield us from suffering, that even the greatest figures must face defeat, and that sometimes the silence of a prophet speaks louder than his words. In Merlin's fall, we see the cost of greatness, but also the enduring mystery of a man whose story refuses to die, who lingers in the imagination as both victim and guardian, warning and promise absence and presence. As Arthurian legends spread through medieval Europe, the figure of Merlin did not remain untouched by the religious atmosphere of the age. Chroniclers and poets, most of whom were monks or clerics, faced a dilemma. Merlin was too powerful, too fascinating, and too essential to the Arthurian story to be dismissed yet. His origins carried traces of pagan lore, druidic wisdom, and even demonic parentage. For Christianity to claim the Arthurian cycle as part of its cultural imagination, Merlin had to be reframed, reshaped, and in many cases, redeemed. Thus began the Christianization of Merlin's story, a process that turned him from a suspicious sorcerer into a figure who, despite his ambiguous origins, served divine purposes in the shaping of kings and the guiding of nations. One of the key strategies used by medieval writers was to cast Merlin as a parallel to biblical prophets. Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, for example, gave Merlin visions that resembled those of Isaiah or Daniel, filled with cryptic symbols, beasts, and apocalyptic warnings. By doing this, Merlin was no longer merely a wizard dabbling in forbidden arts. He became a vessel of revelation, whose words carried the weight of divine providence. The imagery of dragons beneath Vortigern's tower or the prophecies of future kings was deliberately written to sound like Old Testament prophecy. To audiences familiar with Scripture, this made Merlin's visions more acceptable, as they resonated with the style of God's chosen messengers. Another method of Christianization was to interpret Merlin's dubious origins as part of God's plan, rather than proof of his corruption. The tale of his conception by an incubus was troubling, yet writers spun it into a narrative of redemption. Though he was born of demonic intent, God overruled that design and turned him into a prophet who would serve righteousness. In this sense, Merlin became a living example of divine grace, proof that God could bring good even out of evil beginnings. To medieval Christian audiences, this framing was crucial. It showed that Merlin's power was not a threat to faith, but a testimony to the sovereignty of God. The Christianization of Merlin also aligned him with the story of Christendom itself. Arthur's reign was presented as a reflection of a Christian kingdom, a political embodiment of God's justice on earth. Merlin's role then was to be the prophet who prepared the way for that kingdom, much like John the Baptist prepared the way for Christ. By giving Arthur his crown, his sword, and his vision, Merlin acted as a divine instrument, ensuring that Camelot was not just a political creation, but a moral one. Even if his methods seemed strange, the ultimate outcome of his actions, the rise of a just king, and the vision of a holy fellowship was framed as aligned with God's will. Yet the tension was never fully resolved. Some storytellers continued to portray Merlin with suspicion, emphasizing his dangerous knowledge of enchantments and his vulnerability to temptation. In these accounts, his downfall at the hands of the Lady of the Lake served as a moral warning. Even the greatest prophet can fall if he strays too close to forbidden power or human desire. This duality meant that Christianized versions of Merlin carried both reverence and caution. He could be read as a prophet of God's wisdom, but also as a reminder that no human being, however gifted, is free from sin or weakness. This ambivalence reflects the broader struggle of medieval Christianity with magic and folklore. The church condemned sorcery and divination, yet the people hungered for stories filled with wonder prophecy and supernatural intervention. Merlin's legend offered a middle ground, a character who embodied the mystery of the old ways, but was reshaped to serve Christian lessons. In him, the church found a way to absorb pagan tradition without entirely erasing it, baptizing the figure of the wizard into the service of faith. Over time, the Christianized Merlin influenced how readers and listeners interpreted the entire Arthurian cycle. Camelot was no longer just a court of knights. It was a symbolic reflection of the heavenly kingdom. The Grail was no longer just a magical object. It was a Christian relic of Christ's passion. And Merlin, no longer a druidic seer, was reimagined as a prophet, whose voice, however strange, echoed God's plan for Britain. In this transformation, the line between myth and theology blurred, producing a legend that was both entertaining and spiritually instructive. The Christianization of Merlin reveals how myths adapt to cultural and religious needs. His story survived precisely because it was flexible enough to be reframed, allowing medieval Europe to claim him as both prophet and cautionary tale. By reshaping his legend, the church ensured that Merlin would not be cast aside as a relic of pagan superstition, but would instead live on as a figure who, however flawed, bore witness to divine providence. His voice became not just the voice of the wilderness, but a voice that could be heard in the cloisters and cathedrals of Christendom, echoing across centuries as both mystery and message. By the 12th century, Merlin had already become a towering figure in British imagination. But it was medieval literature that solidified his place in the canon of European legend. Writers and chroniclers seized upon his story, weaving him into the fabric of history and romance, reshaping him again and again to suit the tastes, fears, and aspirations of their age. Merlin was no longer a shadowy prophet of the forests or merely Arthur's private counselor. He became a literary icon, appearing in chronicles, romances, and allegories across France, England, and beyond. His voice was amplified by the pens of poets and clerics, who gave his story new layers of richness, while also binding him more firmly to the moral and spiritual concerns of medieval society. Geoffrey of Monmouth is perhaps the most important figure in this transformation. His Historia Regum Britannia, History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1136, introduced a version of Merlin that blended older Welsh traditions with Christian and apocalyptic imagery. Geoffrey's Merlin was a prophet who could foretell the rise and fall of kings, speak in riddles, and lend divine legitimacy to Arthur's reign. Through Geoffrey's work, Merlin ceased to be a figure of local folklore and became a national prophet. His words treated with the same gravitas as scripture. This literary framing gave Merlin endurance. He was not just a character in a story, but a voice whose prophecies could be applied to the political crises of the time. Readers saw in him commentary on their own wars, dynastic struggles, and hopes for unity. French writers soon expanded upon Geoffrey's foundation, weaving Merlin into the growing body of Arthurian romance. In the Vulgate cycle and later prose romances, Merlin became more entangled with the Lady of the Lake, the Grail quest, and the creation of Camelot. Here, his role shifted from mere prophet to the architect of myth itself. He was the one who established the Round Table, who set the conditions for the Grail quest, and who guided the knights through their moral and spiritual journeys. French authors also emphasized his downfall at the hands of Nimue, dramatizing the tension between wisdom and desire, prophecy and temptation. This added a tragic dimension that mirrored the Christian idea that even the greatest saints could fall if they succumbed to sin. The popularity of Merlin in medieval literature reveals how audiences longed for figures who could bridge the gap between myth and morality. Knights were expected to be both warriors and holy men, and the stories of Arthur's court were shaped to inspire this dual ideal. Merlin's presence provided the prophetic framework for such ideals, making clear that knighthood was not merely about power, but about spiritual destiny. His visions reminded audiences that every earthly kingdom was fragile, every court vulnerable, and that the pursuit of holiness was the true quest behind the battles and romances. Yet Merlin's literary life was not confined to the grandeur of romance. He also appeared in more satirical and allegorical works, where his prophecies were used to comment on the political intrigues of the day. Some writers twisted his words into social criticism, using the cloak of prophecy to veil critiques of kings and churchmen. In this way, Merlin's literary presence extended beyond entertainment into politics and theology, making him a vehicle for reflection, warning, and critique. He was both the prophet of Camelot and the commentator on medieval Europe itself. What is striking about these literary traditions is how they continually reshaped Merlin to suit their needs. In some texts, he is noble and nearly saintly. In others, he is suspicious, his demonic heritage emphasized to cast doubt on his wisdom. Sometimes, he is a tragic lover, undone by passion. Other times, a timeless prophet, waiting in silence for his return. This fluidity made him adaptable, a canvas upon which each generation painted its own hopes and fears. And it ensured his survival for a figure that can be reimagined endlessly, never fades. Through medieval literature, Merlin was elevated into something greater than a wizard in Arthur's tale. He became a cultural symbol embodying the mysteries of prophecy, the dangers of temptation, and the eternal struggle between divine order and human folly. Geoffrey of Monmouth gave him his first authoritative voice. French romances gave him tragic depth, and later poets gave him layers of critique and allegory. By the end of the Middle Ages, Merlin had transcended his Celtic roots to become one of the great literary archetypes of Europe. Thus, the pen of medieval writers did what no spell could do. It made Merlin immortal. His story was no longer bound to the forests of Britain or the halls of Camelot, but carried across languages, borders, and centuries. He became a figure as adaptable as the Bible's own prophets, endlessly reinterpreted, never fully resolved. Through literature, Merlin was preserved not as a relic of the past, but as a living voice, always speaking to the present moment, always reminding humanity of the fragile line between wisdom and folly, vision and downfall, prophecy and silence. The figure of Merlin has always been larger than life, not simply because of his role in Arthur's court, but because he embodies a universal archetype, the wise guide, the mentor, the sage, whose vision shapes the destiny of others. In every culture, myths contain such a figure, the one who counsels kings, teaches heroes, and opens the path between the human and the divine. For the Greeks, it was Tiresias, the blind prophet, who revealed truths hidden from mortal eyes. In Jewish tradition, it was Samuel or Nathan prophets who stood beside kings to remind them of their covenant with God. In modern stories, it is echoed in characters like Gandalf or Dumbledore, heirs to the archetype that Merlin first popularized in the Western imagination. To call Merlin the archetype of wisdom is to recognize that his story transcends its time, touching on a pattern embedded deep in the collective human soul. What makes Merlin stand out is not merely his knowledge, but the way he embodies the paradox of wisdom. He is both powerful and vulnerable, both visionary and tragically human. True wisdom, after all, is never sterile or detached. It is always mingled with the pain of experience and the awareness of limitation. Merlin could see the rise of Arthur and the glory of Camelot. Yet he also foresaw its collapse. He could guide kings and shape kingdoms, but he could not save himself from the entrapment of Nimue or from the weight of destiny. His wisdom was not about avoiding suffering, but about recognizing its place in the grand tapestry of life. In this way, Merlin reflects the deeper truth that to be wise is not to escape tragedy, but to understand it. The archetype of wisdom that Merlin embodies also highlights the role of the mentor in the hero's journey. In mythic structure, the hero must always meet a guide who provides the knowledge tools or prophecy necessary for the quest. Without such a figure, the hero would stumble blindly into challenges too great to face. For Arthur, Merlin was that guide. He gave him the sword, the throne, the round table, and the vision of a kingdom built on justice. But like all mentors in myth, Merlin eventually steps aside. The hero must face the final trials alone. The disappearance or death of the mentor is a necessary part of the pattern, for it forces the hero to grow beyond reliance and claim his destiny fully. Merlin's eventual silence, whether through imprisonment or withdrawal, fulfills this archetypal role, showing that the guide's task is not to dominate, but to empower. This pattern also explains Merlin's enduring influence in modern storytelling. He is the prototype of the wise old man who appears in countless myths, legends, and fantasies. He is the figure who represents the collective wisdom of the past, handed down to the present generation. Psychologist Carl Jung saw such figures as manifestations of the archetype of the wise old man, a symbol that emerges across cultures because it reflects a deep psychological truth. Human beings instinctively long for guidance from those who have walked the path before them. Merlin, with his long beard, cryptic riddles, and prophetic visions, became the Western world's most recognizable face of this archetype. Yet Merlin is not a static archetype. Unlike purely benevolent guides, his story contains shadows. His questionable birth, his use of enchantment, his entrapment by Nimue. All these elements add complexity, reminding us that wisdom is never pure or easy. It comes with risk, with temptation, with the possibility of error. This makes him a far more compelling archetype than a flawless sage. He is a mentor who embodies the full human experience, not just the light, but also the shadow. His story teaches that wisdom is not the absence of failure, but the ability to see meaning, even in failure, to transform loss into lesson. As an archetype of wisdom, Merlin also embodies the balance between knowledge and mystery. He knew the hidden laws of nature, the secrets of kingship, the unfolding of destiny. Yet his wisdom was never about complete control. He could guide but not dictate, foresee but not prevent. This humility before mystery is perhaps the highest mark of true wisdom. In Scripture, Solomon was praised not simply for knowledge, but for asking God for discernment. Likewise, Merlin's greatness lies not in omnipotence, but in discernment, in recognizing the limits of power and the necessity of aligning human action with divine purpose. One of the most fascinating aspects of Merlin's legend is how seamlessly he can be compared with figures from the Bible. Though his story arises from Celtic and medieval traditions, the archetype he represents, the prophet who shapes kings, warns nations, and bridges heaven and earth, has striking echoes in Scripture. Medieval chroniclers were quick to notice these parallels, and by framing Merlin in language reminiscent of the prophets, they ensured that his legend resonated not only as folklore, but as a story carrying spiritual weight. To see Merlin alongside biblical figures is to realize that his myth is not merely a story of Britain, but part of a larger human pattern, the longing for a voice that reveals God's plan in the midst of history. Perhaps the closest parallel is with the prophet Samuel. Just as Merlin guided Arthur, Samuel guided Saul and David, anointing them with divine authority and reminding them that their thrones existed only under God's covenant. Samuel was a child of miraculous birth, dedicated to God's service, and from a young age he heard the divine voice that others could not. Merlin too was marked from childhood with strange origins and prophetic insight that baffled kings and counselors. Both men stood at the threshold of a nation's destiny, ensuring that the rise of kings was framed not as mere political chance, but as fulfillment of providence. Their role was not to rule directly, but to legitimize rule, reminding kings that their crowns were borrowed, not earned. Another powerful comparison is Elijah, the prophet of fire and confrontation. Elijah stood against kings, called down fire from heaven, and retreated to the wilderness where he heard the still small voice of God. Merlin too is often depicted as withdrawing to forests, living among animals, and returning with visions that unsettled rulers. His madness in the wilderness mirrors Elijah's despair under the broom tree, a reminder that prophets carry the burden of isolation and sorrow alongside their gifts. Both figures embody the paradox of power, strong in vision, yet broken in spirit, compelled to speak truths that others would rather ignore. Daniel also provides a striking parallel. In Babylon, Daniel interpreted the dreams of kings, unveiling the hidden meaning of symbols, statues, beasts, visions of empires rising and falling. Merlin's prophecies, often delivered in riddles and images, served a similar function for Britain. He spoke of dragons, lions, and storms, images that demanded interpretation and seemed to contain more than one layer of meaning. Just as Daniel's visions were applied to future kingdoms long after his time, so Merlin's prophecies were reinterpreted by later generations to explain their own wars and rulers. In both cases, the prophet's words transcended their historical moment, becoming a timeless commentary on the struggle between earthly power and divine order. Even Moses offers a reflection of Merlin's role. Moses stood as mediator between God and Israel, leading his people out of bondage and giving them laws that would define their covenant. Merlin, though not a lawgiver in the same sense, mediated between divine mystery and Arthur's kingdom. He shaped the round table as a covenantal symbol, reminding Arthur and his knights that their unity was grounded not in power, but in justice. Like Moses, Merlin never fully entered the promised kingdom. Just as Moses died before entering the land of Canaan, so Merlin vanished before Camelot reached its final collapse, leaving his people to carry on without him. In this parallel, we see the archetypal truth. Prophets prepare the way, but the fulfillment always lies beyond them. These biblical echoes explain why Merlin's legend was so easily absorbed into Christian imagination. Medieval audiences did not see him as a foreign wizard alone, but as a figure who could be understood within their own spiritual framework. He was the Samuel of Britain, the Elijah of the forests, the Daniel of the Isles, the Moses of Camelot. This gave his story authority, for it suggested that Britain, like Israel, had been guided by prophets, that its kings were not accidental, but chosen, that its destiny was written into the divine plan. To hear Merlin speak was to hear in some mysterious way an echo of the biblical prophets who shaped nations with their words. Yet the parallels also highlight the tragedy of Merlin. Like the prophets, he carried the burden of rejection. Kings sought him when his words promised glory, but ignored him when his warnings spoke of downfall. His love for Nimue, his entrapment, and his eventual silence mirror the fate of prophets who were cast aside, imprisoned, or martyred. In this, Merlin's story reminds us that to speak for providence is to invite misunderstanding. For truth is rarely welcomed by those it unsettles. Ultimately, the biblical parallels reveal that Merlin's legend is not only a Celtic or medieval invention, but part of a universal archetype of prophecy. Every culture tells stories of figures who bridge heaven and earth, who warn kings and guide nations, who see more than others and suffer for it. By placing Merlin alongside Samuel, Elijah, Daniel, and Moses, we see him not as an anomaly, but as a reflection of humanity's enduring need for voices that call us to something higher. His story resonates because it carries the same message the prophets carried, that history is not random, that kings are accountable, and that the voice of wisdom, though often silenced, never fully dies. Though Merlin's roots stretch deep into the soil of Celtic myth and medieval romance, his story has not remained confined to the dusty manuscripts of history. Across centuries, poets, playwrights, novelists, and filmmakers have reimagined him again and again, each age reshaping him to mirror its own questions and anxieties. The endurance of Merlin in modern retellings proves that he is not simply a character from the past, but an archetype who continues to speak to the present. In each new version, Merlin reflects humanity's longing for wisdom, its suspicion of power, and its fascination with the mysterious figure who knows both the greatness and the fragility of kings. During the Renaissance and early modern period, Merlin's legend was already being reworked for political and cultural purposes. Elizabethan writers invoked him as a prophet of national destiny, applying his riddling words to England's own struggles and triumphs. His image appeared in plays and poetry, not only as Arthur's guide, but as a seer whose voice could still interpret the turbulence of Europe. To invoke Merlin was to invoke the authority of the past, lending weight to claims about divine providence and royal legitimacy. Just as Geoffrey of Monmouth's medieval audience had applied his prophecies to their own time, so too did later generations use Merlin as a timeless commentator. In the Romantic period of the 18th and 19th centuries, Merlin was reborn as a figure of mystery and melancholy, the wild prophet of nature. Poets like Alfred Lord Tennyson, in his Idylls of the King, portrayed him not only as a counselor of Arthur, but as a tragic lover undone by his passion for Vivian. Here, Merlin became a symbol of the dangers of desire and the vulnerability of even the greatest minds. This version resonated with romantic sensibilities, which emphasized passion nature and the tragic depth of human experience. Through Tennyson and others, Merlin was woven into the literary fabric of the age, no longer merely a medieval prophet, but a timeless warning of love's entrapment. In the 20th century, Merlin's legend took on new life in novels and fantasy literature. Writers such as T.H. White in The Once and Future King reimagined him as a quirky time-traveling mentor who knew both the past and the future. White's Merlin taught Arthur not only about kingship, but about morality, justice, and the cost of power embedding within the story, a profound reflection on human nature. This version of Merlin influenced countless later retellings, including modern fantasy archetypes like Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings and Dumbledore in Harry Potter. Both characters carry Merlin's DNA, the wise old guide, eccentric, yet profound, who mentors the hero and represents the bridge between ordinary life and epic destiny. Film and television have also kept Merlin alive in the cultural imagination. From the grand epics like Excalibur 1981, where he was portrayed with brooding gravitas, to the BBC series Merlin 2008-2012, which recast him as a young man, discovering his gifts while secretly guiding Arthur. Each retelling has adapted the character for new audiences. Sometimes he is a majestic prophet, sometimes a flawed mentor, sometimes a reluctant hero himself. The BBC version in particular gave him vulnerability and relatability, showing him not as a distant sage, but as a human, struggling to balance secrecy, loyalty, and destiny. Such portrayals highlight how adaptable Merlin is. He can be ancient or youthful, tragic or comic, mystical or grounded. Yet in every form, he retains his essential role as the guide between human fragility and divine destiny. What modern retellings often emphasize is the humanity of Merlin. While medieval writers wrestled with his demonic origins and his prophetic legitimacy, modern authors tend to focus on his inner struggles, his loneliness, his longing, his burden of foresight. This makes him less a figure of fear and more a mirror of our own lives. We may not command dragons or foresee kingdoms, but we know what it is to carry burdens others cannot understand, to love and lose, to strive for wisdom in a world that often resists it. In making Merlin more human, modern retellings keep him relevant, transforming him into a character who belongs not only to the past, but to every age. Yet even as modern versions humanize him, they also preserve his archetypal role. He is still the wise mentor, the one who guides heroes into their destiny. He is still the prophet, warning of the dangers of pride and betrayal. He is still the tragic figure undone by his own humanity. And he is still the symbol of timeless wisdom, reminding us that the search for meaning, justice, and truth is never-ending. Each retelling may shift the details, but the essence remains. Merlin is the voice that speaks from the margins, the guide who prepares the way, the reminder that behind every kingdom lies a vision greater than swords or crowns. In the end, the endurance of Merlin in modern retellings proves that his story is not bound to any single culture or century. He is as much a figure for today as he was for medieval Britain. As long as humanity longs for wisdom, struggles with power, and dreams of kingdoms where justice reigns, the figure of Merlin will return again and again, reshaped, but never silenced. His voice continues to echo across literature, film, and imagination, calling us to listen for the deeper truths beneath the surface of our world. Even after centuries of storytelling adaptation and reinterpretation, Merlin remains a figure wrapped in mystery. Unlike Arthur, who dies at Camlan, or Guinevere, whose fate is woven into penitence and retreat, Merlin's story does not end in clarity. Instead, it ends in silence, ambiguity, and suggestion. Was he imprisoned forever by Nimue, bound in a crystal cave or a tower of glass? Did he retreat into the forest to live as a wild hermit, fading from history, but never truly gone? Or does he still sleep beneath the hills, waiting for the moment when Britain most needs him to rise again? The refusal of his story to resolve is precisely what gives it its power, for it allows Merlin to live not as a character who belonged to one age, but as a timeless archetype whose presence can always be reawakened. This enduring mystery is essential to his function as a prophet. Prophets by nature are not meant to provide neat closure. They point beyond themselves, leaving riddles, questions, and unfinished visions. Merlin's disappearance is a kind of prophecy in itself, a symbol that wisdom is never fully possessed, never fully exhausted, but always waiting to be rediscovered by those with ears to hear. His silence speaks as powerfully as his words. Just as Christ's parables left hearers unsettled and searching, so Merlin's unresolved fate leaves us restless, as wondering whether he might return, whether he ever truly left at all. The motif of the once and future is usually applied to Arthur, who is said to sleep in Avalon until Britain's darkest hour. Yet the same theme clings to Merlin. If Arthur represents the king who will return, Merlin represents the prophet who will awaken the voice of guidance, ready to re-emerge when the world again needs vision. This dual motif ensures that the Arthurian legend is not merely about the past, but also about the future. It is not a closed book, but a living story, always capable of renewal. Merlin's enduring mystery keeps the story alive. For as long as we wonder where he went, we continue to listen for his voice. His mystery also resonates because it reflects the human condition. Wisdom in our lives is often glimpsed, but never fully grasped. We experience moments of insight, visions of truth, but they slip away, leaving us longing for more. Merlin embodies this fleeting nature of wisdom. He appears, guides, prophesies, and then vanishes. He reminds us that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit, something we must continually seek in every generation. His story endures not because it is complete, but because it refuses to be complete, mirroring our own endless search for meaning. In literature and modern imagination, this unresolved quality allows Merlin to be endlessly reinvented. He can be ancient or youthful, saintly or sinister, mentor or prisoner. Because his end is not fixed, his story remains open, adaptable to the needs of new times. For medieval audiences, he was the prophet who gave legitimacy to kings. For romantics, he was the tragic sage undone by love. For modern fantasy, he is the archetype of the mentor who guides the hero. Each version is possible because the original legend leaves space for interpretation. Merlin's mystery is not a flaw, but a gift ensuring his immortality in storytelling. There is also a theological dimension to his mystery. If Arthur's kingdom represented the dream of a just society, Merlin represented the wisdom necessary to sustain it. Yet when he vanishes, Camelot collapses, as if to say that without vision, even the noblest kingdom falls. This echoes Proverbs 29:18. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Merlin's disappearance thus becomes a parable without the prophetic voice human institutions cannot endure. His absence is not only a personal tragedy, but a cosmic warning, a reminder that every age must seek out wisdom or face its own downfall. And so Merlin lingers at the edges of imagination, neither fully gone nor fully present. He is a shadow in the forest, a whisper in the stones, a name spoken when people yearn for guidance in dark times. His enduring mystery ensures that he can never be relegated to mere history. He is the eternal prophet, the wise guide whose fate reflects our own longing for truth and our fear of losing it. Every age reawakens him because every age needs him. In the end, Merlin's greatest power is not the prophecies he uttered or the enchantments he performed, but the fact that his story refuses to die. His mystery is his immortality. We do not know where he went, and that is precisely why we still listen for him. As long as human beings hunger for vision, as long as nations long for guidance, as long as we tell stories of kings and prophets, Merlin will endure not just as the wizard of Arthurian myth, but as the timeless embodiment of wisdom, waiting in silence forever on the edge of return. As we reach the conclusion of this journey, through the life and legend of Merlin, we are left with more than just the memory of a wizard in robes or the image of a prophet whispering in Arthur's ear. We are left with a figure who transcends his own story, a symbol of wisdom, mystery, and the eternal tension between destiny and desire. Merlin's legend is not confined to the pages of medieval chronicles or the verses of romantic poets. It is alive, echoing through centuries of retelling, adapting to each generation that seeks meaning in his tale. His legacy is not in what he did alone, but in what he represents: the human longing for guidance, the warning that wisdom carries a cost, and the hope that vision can shape even the darkest times. The story of Merlin reminds us that wisdom is never easy, never and never without danger. He was a man who saw the future, yet could not escape it. A prophet whose words shaped kings, yet whose own heart was vulnerable to love and betrayal. His downfall was not the sword or the battlefield, but the quiet entrapment of desire, a tragedy that reveals the fragility of even the greatest souls. And yet this is precisely why his story endures. If Merlin had been flawless, he would have been a myth too distant to matter. It is his weakness alongside his strength, his humanity alongside his mystery, that makes him unforgettable. We see in him the paradox of our own lives, the struggle to balance vision with vulnerability, to hold wisdom in a world that resists it, to long for truth even when it hurts. Merlin's legacy is also inseparable from the dream of Camelot. Without him, Arthur would have been just another warlord, and the Round Table might never have been conceived. It was Merlin's vision that transformed a kingdom into a myth, that turned warriors into knights bound by covenant, and that elevated a throne into a reflection of heavenly order. Camelot may have fallen, but the ideals it carried, justice, equality, fellowship, did not die. They live on precisely because Merlin gave them prophetic shape, embedding them in story so deeply that they still stir our imagination today. To speak of Camelot is to speak of possibility, and behind that possibility stands Merlin, the architect of vision. But perhaps the most profound part of Merlin's legacy is his silence. Unlike Arthur, whose death at Camlin is a dramatic end, Merlin simply disappears into a cave, a tower, a forest, or a sleep from which he has yet to awaken. This ambiguity is not a weakness of the story, but its greatest strength. It allows Merlin to remain timeless, unfinished, always waiting. His silence is a mirror for us. Do we still listen for the prophetic voice, or have we forgotten it? Do we still honor the wisdom that calls us beyond power and pride, or do we dismiss it as madness? Merlin's absence becomes a challenge, reminding us that wisdom must always be sought anew, that prophets are always at risk of being ignored or silenced. and that without vision, kingdoms collapse. The enduring mystery of Merlin ensures that he belongs not only to the past, but also to the future. Each age reinvents him, because each age needs him. He can be the national prophet of Britain, the tragic sage of romantic poetry, the kindly mentor of fantasy novels, or the flawed human searching for love. His adaptability is his immortality. Wherever there is a story of heroes and kingdoms, there is room for Merlin, the one who sees beyond the moment, the one who whispers of destiny, the one who reminds us that power without wisdom is ruin. In the end, Merlin's legacy is not about magic tricks or fairy tale enchantments. It is about the human hunger for guidance, the eternal search for meaning, and the recognition that wisdom, though costly, is the only path to true greatness. His story stands as both inspiration and warning inspiration, that vision can shape history, warning that even visionaries are human and fragile. To remember Merlin is to remember that every kingdom, every generation, and every individual needs a voice that speaks beyond the noise of the moment, pointing to truths that endure. And so the wizard of Arthurian legend remains with us, not as a relic of medieval myth, but as a living archetype, forever speaking through story, forever reminding us of the fragile bond between vision and power, destiny and freedom. Merlin has not vanished. He waits as he always has, in the mists of imagination, in the silence of prophecy, in the timeless space where wisdom never dies. His legacy is not finished because our need for it is not finished. Whenever humanity looks for meaning, Merlin will rise again. Merlin, as the archetype of wisdom, continues to inspire because he mirrors our own search for guidance. In every age, people look for mentors, for voices that can interpret chaos and offer vision. In Merlin, we see the timeless figure of the guide, flawed yet profound, who reminds us that wisdom is not about avoiding pain, but about seeing its place in destiny. His story reassures us that even in times of collapse, there is meaning to be found, and even in silence, the voice of wisdom still lingers.